Everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast, where you can expand your sustainable and ESG investing opportunities with insights from leaders in the field. I'm Paul Ellis, your host for these weekly conversations about developments in this fast-growing industry. My guest today is Joey Lake, Chief Operating Officer at the Climate Service, a leader in climate risk analytics for investors and businesses. Based in New York, Lake plays a key role in building strategic partnerships and meeting the rapidly expanding demand for the Climate Services Climanomics platform, software that puts a price on climate risk and enables reporting and disclosure consistent with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. That's the TCFD, right, Joey?
Yes.
So, welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast, Joey.
Thanks so much for having me here, Paul.
Let's begin our conversation today by giving our investor and financial advisor audience some additional information about TCFD and about the Climate Service, Climanomics platform. Tell us a little bit about both of those things.
Thanks, Paul. So the Climate Service is a 2.5-year-old software as a service company, and we use world-class science and technology to help investors and businesses to measure their risk from climate change. So we don't look at the impact of a company on the climate, rather we look at the impact of climate change on a company. So what's your risk from flooding, sea level rise, wildfires, temperature change, and so on. But also what's your transition risk as the world moves to a lower carbon economy. And the TCFD that you mentioned, there's sort of three factors that I think are really driving demand for climate risk analytics. And TCFD is the regulatory push. So that was sort of set up in 2015 when Mike Bloomberg, who was doing a different thing back then,
Yes,
he got together with Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England.
that's right.
And they tried to answer this question that the G20 had posed, which is climate risk a risk to the financial system? And so in 2017, they published some guidelines and suggested how companies and investors should measure and disclose their potential risk and opportunity from the changing climate. So that has created a huge amount of demand for climate risk analytics. More than 1,000 of the biggest companies and investors in the world have agreed to comply with these guidelines. And it's only a question of when rather than if this becomes mandatory rather than guidance.
Right. So the TCFD as a framework, if you will, has really become the standard for climate risk analysis. I think that's what I hear you saying on a global basis.
I think that's fair to say. There's been a lot of conversation in the broader ESG space about the sort of alphabet soup of different standards that are out there.
Right.
And so if you focus just on the E of ESG, so just talking about the environment, and then even within that, a subset of looking at your climate risk rather than your impact on the environment, I think there's a clear coalescing around the TCFD as the framework that's most appropriate here and that's really influential for most investors and companies. So our Climanomics platform, which puts a price on climate risk, is completely aligned with the TCFD. And then later this year, you're going to see a lot of different central banks issue some guidance of their own about how financial institutions should comply with climate risk disclosure, and I think TCFD will play a big part in that also.
Okay, great. Now, I know you recently announced that the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants has selected the Climate Service for its Startup Accelerator to promote innovation in the accounting profession. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And this is further recognition that climate risk is viewed as a business critical issue, to use your words, to measure and to manage, right?
I think that's absolutely correct. I think that when you see organizations like the AICPA stepping into this space, that to me sends a signal that climate risk is moving from the initial sort of early adopters to the mainstream. And again, I think it's only a matter of time before this becomes a standard risk to disclose in your annual financial reporting, as we do with so many other types of material risks. And that's part of our fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders. We're particularly thrilled to partner with the AICPA because they are, I think, the most influential body of professional accountants in the world. and they represent over 500,000 members across 170 odd countries. So for us, this is, again, it sends a signal to the broader market that climate risk is moving into the mainstream.
Well, I would think for you at the Climate Service, that also gives you an opportunity to have a global dialogue on an ongoing basis with not just companies, but with regulators. Is that right?
Absolutely. So we are going to contribute. The Bank of England is really leading, I would say, on the regulatory side around climate risk stress testing. This conversation that has picked up so much steam over the last few months. So we will be contributing to that conversation, and we're very open. I think we've built one of the world's leading climate risk analytics platforms, and we have some of the world's leading experts on the science side and on the finance side working with us or advising us, and we're really keen to contribute that knowledge to regulators and to help provide them with more information so that they can build the best guidelines and the best frameworks for companies and investors to adopt.
Okay, good. Now, you mentioned climate science. Climate science has been around for over 40 years. If I understand the history of this movement correctly, the IPCC has been around and producing climate stress data for 40 years, and all of it has really been fairly accurate in terms of where we are today based on where the IPCC was projecting we would be over 40 years ago. There's more and more focus on the science as well, from regulators, from investors as well. And I would like to have another conversation down the road when you have some time to develop these new partnerships that you have around the science especially. So
yeah, I think on the science side of things, we're really grateful and feel very lucky that we have so many scientific experts at the Climate Service. So our advisory board, which is really quite fabulous, includes 4 of the IPCC Nobel Prize winners.
Yes.
James and Terry, our 2 co-founders, have decades of experience in this area. James himself studied physical sciences at Harvard and MIT. So we really feel that we are grounded in the best science available, and that's very important to a lot of our clients and our partners because climate science is a very sensitive topic. And while I agree with you that the scientific projections have been more or less accurate for the last 40 years or so, some people require further evidence to see that and need to see it with their own eyes. I find this particularly amusing because prior to joining the Climate Service, I worked for the Economist Intelligence Unit where I was the Director of Global Forecasting. So we produced political and economic forecasts for 200 countries around the world. And I can tell you that very few people have got a political forecast correct over the last 4 years. And yet every asset manager and big bank in the world has macroeconomic and political forecasting at the core of their risk management systems. On the flip side of this, the scientific predictions have been more or less in line with what we expected 40 years ago. And so I think we're seeing a pretty rapid movement from those early conversations with a client to them actually getting very comfortable with the science behind it.
Good. Well, that's a very good point. I'm glad that you brought that up. Now, you were quoted in a Reuters article from October of 2019 about the learning curve Latin American banks and corporations are facing when they turn to sustainable lending as a viable financing tool. In that article, you said the financial industry is waking up at a rapid pace to the risk and opportunities from the changing climate and the transition to a lower carbon economy. We've moved from this information being a nice to have to a need to have. So Joey, is the financial industry you referenced in that article limited to Latin America, or are banks and corporations in the US, Europe, and Asia also waking up to the risks and opportunities from changing climate and transition to a lower carbon economy?
This is certainly a global conversation now. So this conversation around climate risk and opportunity is happening in every corner of the world. I do think there's maybe 3 tiers to that. So
Okay.
who are the first to move? I think you definitely need to look to Europe there. I think the Netherlands in particular is so exposed. So much of the country is actually below sea level. So the regulators there were kind of ahead of the curve, and the response in the private sector was also a bit more forward thinking. And as I said previously, the Bank of England is leading the charge. Mark Carney in particular has done a very good job in this area. So I would look to Europe as the first tier of movers.
I see.
Then we had a sort of a second tier, and in that bucket I would probably include, in Asia I would include Australia and Japan. I'd also include Canada. So again, slightly more progressive. And now what we're seeing is the third tier of movement, which is a lot of the other leading economies who have sort of caught up. And the good news for them is that they can rapidly catch up because they can build on the work that's been done over the previous few years in those other countries.
Okay, good. Now I'm going to quote you again, Joey. And this time it's from an article you wrote for Bloomberg Environment on February 13th of this year. And that featured an article entitled "Capitalism Steps Up as Climate Change Threatens to Reshape Markets." You wrote, "In the business world, climate has transformed from a marketing issue to a business critical risk." So please expand on this statement for our investor and advisor audience.
Sure. I think we're on a journey here. So this conversation 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been happening in the marketing department or the corporate social responsibility department. And there was also, I think, a large risk at that time of greenwashing, and that risk has not gone away. When I say it's become a business critical issue, every large company in every sector recognizes the risk that they face, present day risk and future risk from the changing climate. So to give you some examples there,
Sure.
I've spoken to shipping companies who want to understand how the change in sea level will impact their trade routes. That will have huge repercussions, not just for the shipping company, but also anybody who depends on them as part of their supply chain. I've spoken to some of the world's leading sports companies who want to understand how the increase in temperature in parts of the world will perhaps make it too hot to exercise outdoors, and what will that mean for demand for their goods and services? Is there sufficient infrastructure in some of these countries for people to exercise or work out indoors? I've spoken to most of the largest asset managers in the world over the last 2 years who all recognize that climate risk is a material risk that they should be measuring, because if they can't measure it, how on earth are they supposed to manage it? My own view here is that climate risk is the largest idiosyncratic risk that's left largely unmeasured by most of the biggest companies and financial institutions in the world today. And if you have that insight, if you're an investor and you have that insight, why on earth would you not try and capture the opportunity there, recognizing that at some point this will be priced in by the market, and at the moment it's not? And if you can tell an investor that there's this reality out there that's currently unpriced in financial markets,
Yes.
I mean, that's gold dust.
It really is. And now the European marketplace, continuing in their leadership role, has some new regulatory protocols out being assessed by the member countries this year, I believe, that some of which may end up being written into law in many of those economies by the end of this year. Is that something that you see happening elsewhere in the world? I know here in the States, at the federal level, there's very little or no movement in that direction. In fact, it's even with the cars being driven in reverse in some cases. But at the state level, in places like California, in New York, and even a consortium of states, I think, in the Northeast or in this part of the country where we are, they're starting to put in standards for greenhouse gas emissions and starting to look at ways to tax carbon and things like that. What do you see happening elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to climate risk and opportunity, one of the most interesting organizations to keep an eye on is the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS.
Okay.
So this is an organization of 54 different central banks from around the world. So these are the folks who kind of set the rules of engagement. And that includes most of the major central banks, the ECB, the Bank of China. It does not currently include the US Federal Reserve, but my understanding is the Fed does listen intently to the conversations that are happening there.
Okay.
And so they have, the NGFS has a particularly important meeting in April, next month now, in which it will sort of set some of the ground rules for what they expect companies to do when it comes to climate risk, how they expect them to disclose, what sort of climate scenarios they should be looking at, and so on. So what you're seeing now is the formation of a whole new set of regulations, and in fact a whole new industry around a particular type of risk. And it's very rare that we see something like this. A lot of folks I've spoken to in the field compare it, in the banking world in particular, compare it to cyber risk, and how that kind of came out of nowhere several years ago, and is now a huge industry that's so critical and important for every financial institution to manage.
You know, I was just reading a story yesterday, maybe it was even this morning, about J.P. Morgan Chase having made an announcement that they are no longer planning to underwrite oil and gas exploration in the Arctic. And this is having a significant potential impact on I think a $64 billion trust fund that's been established in the state of Alaska to promote oil and gas exploration. So is this an example of the kind of regulatory process that we're going to see more of?
This is really interesting. So we've seen really significant announcements this year from some of the largest companies in the world and the largest banks in the world. So some similar examples to that. Microsoft this year said it was going to go carbon neutral,
right,
I think by 2030 or so, and actually carbon negative. And by 2050, it wants to have extracted all of the emissions that it's put into the atmosphere since it was founded in 1975 or 1976.
Yes.
JetBlue and Delta, two leaders in the aviation industry, have both said that they'll also go carbon neutral this year. A lot of financial institutions are saying that they'll stop lending to some of the dirtiest fossil fuels. So I certainly think, and this is a subject of much debate, but I certainly think that we've reached a tipping point in this conversation where the private sector is receiving so much pressure from its shareholders and from its customers to act in a much cleaner way and to stop contributing to climate change, that you're now seeing very tangible actions coming from that. Whereas previously there was some greenwashing going on. Now you're actually seeing some really significant action from some of the world's largest leading companies.
Now, what sectors of the global economy, in your opinion, are making the most progress in climate risk adaptation? Let's just say right now in 2020, and for what reasons are these sectors leading the transition to a low carbon economy?
There's so many different ways I could answer this question, Paul.
Okay.
So let me try this one that's just popped into my head.
Sure.
I think as people who live on this planet, the action that we would like to see is from the sectors that are making the biggest contribution. So there's two choices there. Do you withdraw from those sectors? Do you stop financing them like some of the banks are doing? Or do you engage them and try and get them to change how they do business? So you think very quickly of sort of the oil and gas industry and so on. So we've seen some interesting moves, I would say, from BP, who have a new CEO, and they've made some big announcements there. I think it's too early to tell at this stage how much substantive action we can expect in that area. But I, for one, am very encouraged when you see some of the organizations that could have the biggest impact taking this topic seriously and then taking actions as a result of that.
Yeah.
And I also think, sorry to
follow up
on that.
Yeah.
What's really interesting as well is when you see this starting to get priced into stock markets. So a lot of people have drawn the parallel performance of some of the largest traditional automakers over the last couple of years, and compare that to Tesla. And so the rise of Tesla is mirrored in some ways by the decline in stock prices of some of the larger traditional automakers, who do not have the same capabilities when it comes to electric vehicles. And so that's a forward-looking, starting to price in what you expect to see happen in the future.
Now, it's also true, I believe, that emissions from the transportation sector have now passed emissions from the utility sector or other large sectors which have been fairly aggressive in the last, let's say, 5 years, but maybe even longer, the last 10 years, in starting to implement renewable and more sustainable energy supply resources for their sector. I'm attending an event sponsored by NYSERDA on Friday that's about the electric vehicle transition, and it seemed, from what I understand, the thing that's going to be the primary topic there is commercial fleets of electric vehicles versus individual electric vehicles, because as the guy who invited me said, when a chief investment officer looks at the numbers, and the numbers work in terms of replacing his commercial fleet with electric vehicles, there's no emotion in his next decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that really resonates with me, that message. And I think that's something that we came around to some time ago, that instead of trying to persuade people or push forward a sort of a moral agenda and what's your responsibility here, you need to put a price on this. And when you can put a price on climate risk, that's very persuasive. That's persuasive to a CEO, to a CIO, to a CFO, as you said already. And the numbers don't lie.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for example, later this week, I'm recording a podcast with the CEO of the largest wood pellet manufacturer in the world, which is headquarters outside of Washington, D.C. But they are literally replacing over 3.5 million metric tons of coal fuel for the utility sector, primarily in Europe and Japan, with wood pellets, which are still a burnt fuel, but they have lower carbon emissions. And so at the same time, they're growing the forests that they harvest from in the southeastern United States over the last decade by an additional 10% of total tree population.
Right.
So that's another example of this type of transition process that we're undergoing.
Yes, and it's really fascinating because there are literally thousands or millions of examples like that, and this it astonishes me sometimes. Like, we spend all day every day talking to Fortune 500 companies and some of the largest banks and asset managers in the world. The US federal government is a client of ours, so we have a big variety of clients. But what's clear to me when you add up all those different conversations into one, this is the largest transformation that I've seen in the world in my lifetime.
Yes,
I can't
agree.
think of...
And I'm older than you.
I'll take your word for that, Paul. I can't think of the last time when we've seen the world go through a transformation like this that will touch every industry, that will touch millions of workers, millions of customers. Every big company in the world will be altered by this. And it's a really fascinating collection of stories to see.
Yeah. Now, Joey, as you already mentioned, prior to launching the Climate Service, you were Managing Director of Climate Risk at The Economist and a member of the Economist Intelligence Unit prior to that, or during that same time. How does the 12 years of experience that you had there inform and support your current role at the Climate Service?
It informs it in a lot of different ways. So I had a few different jobs at the Economist Group. One was the Director of Global Forecasting. So I was responsible for the forecasts of 200 countries around the world. So my background is in risk. It's in risk and analysis and forecasting. So whether that risk is sovereign risk, credit risk, currency risk, macro risk, and so on. And that's the lens that I bring to the climate change conversation. I view this as another risk that businesses and investors should be measuring. And it's not, I don't think, any more difficult to measure and manage than some of the risks that I've just talked about. And I think that my journey, the change that my career took a couple of years ago, when we found that a lot of our corporate and financial clients were asking about climate risk, and that sort of changed my career path in this direction. It's being reflected by a lot of different people who have similar backgrounds to me, working in various types of risk, and are now turning their focus to climate, because this is the most important challenge, I would say, of our time, if not of all time. It's an existential threat, and I'm really encouraged to see other folks with that sort of background, again, bring their experience to bear on this conversation. As an example, we just hired a new VP of Research recently, Dr. Therese Fang, who has a PhD in environmental economics from Yale, but has spent the last 20 years working in risk architecture and stress testing at major financial organizations like Morgan Stanley and Fitch and Jefferies and so on. So she brings all of that experience to bear on this topic. And again, I find it heartening that we have experts like Therese who are able to come into this conversation and apply that knowledge and expertise to the climate change conversation.
Well, I want to write down her name before you leave, because I'm going to invite her to do a podcast with me soon.
I'm sure she'd love that.
Great. So, Joey, there's a lot more we can talk and will talk about at another time. But for today, we're just about out of our scheduled recording time. So I want to thank you, Joey Lake, Chief Operating Officer at the Climate Service, for joining me today on the Sustainable Finance Podcast. Joey, how can the Sustainable Finance Podcast investor and advisor viewers reach your team at the Climate Service, and what other information about the Climate Service can they find on your website, for example?
Thanks so much, Paul, and thank you for having me today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'll leave you with two final points. The first one is I just want to share what our mission is as an organization.
Please do.
Our mission is to embed climate risk data into every financial decision on the planet, because we believe that once it's priced into financial and business decision making, it will accelerate the transition to a lower carbon economy. We're very much mission led, and that's our mission. And then to answer your question more directly, how can you hear more about us? I would encourage anyone to go to our website, theclimateservice.com, and sign up for our monthly newsletter. We, as you know, Paul, we've had some big announcements recently, and we've got another few coming down the line as well. So that's probably the best way to keep up to date with everything that's happening at the Climate Service.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining us, Joey. And to our subscribers, please join us next week for another episode of the Sustainable Finance Podcast, as well as quarterly Sustainable Finance webinars, which feature panels of sustainable and impact investing experts like Joey Lake, in dialogue about important developments in the industry. I'm Paul Ellis, your host for these podcast and webinar programs, and this is the Sustainable Finance Podcast.